I came home from work on a freezing Tuesday evening in February to find my house in Naperville, Illinois, completely dark and silent, which was odd because I had left the living room lamp on that morning like I always did. The temperature outside hovered around 15 degrees, and I could already feel the chill seeping through the walls as I stepped inside and flicked the light switch. Nothing happened. I tried another switch, then another, growing more concerned with each failed attempt. My name is Xavier Jacobs, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision for 3 years without any major issues, paying my mortgage on time, keeping my lawn pristine, and generally staying out of everyone's way. I checked my phone to see if there were any alerts from the power company about outages in the area, but there was nothing. My neighbors' houses were all lit up normally, their warm glows mocking the darkness of my own home. I walked outside and checked my electrical meter, and that was when I noticed something that made my blood run cold despite the winter air. There was a bright orange tag hanging from the meter with bold letters that read, "Disconnected by order of Meadowbrook Hills HOA." Below that, in smaller print, it stated that my power had been shut off due to violations of community standards and would remain off until all fines were paid and violations corrected. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of this. I had never received any notices about violations, and I certainly had never been informed that the HOA had the authority to disconnect my power. I pulled out my phone and called the emergency number for Commonwealth Edison, our local utility company. After navigating through several automated menus, I finally reached a real person named Marcus, who sounded genuinely confused when I explained the situation. "Sir, I'm looking at your account right now, and it shows your service was disconnected today at 2:15 in the afternoon," Marcus said, his keyboard clicking in the background. "But this is strange. The disconnection wasn't ordered by us. It looks like someone physically went to your meter and shut it off, then locked it." "The HOA put a tag on my meter saying they ordered it," I explained, my frustration growing as the cold inside my house became more noticeable. "Can you tell me if that's even legal? Can they do that?" There was a long pause, and I could hear Marcus discussing something with someone else in his office. When he came back on the line, his tone had shifted from confused to serious. "Mr. Jacobs, what your HOA did is not only illegal, it's actually a criminal offense. Only licensed utility workers are authorized to disconnect service, and only Commonwealth Edison has the authority to order a disconnection. If your HOA hired someone to do this, or if board members did it themselves, they've committed theft of services and potentially trespassing on utility company property. That meter and the connection equipment belong to us, not to them." Relief washed over me, quickly followed by anger. "So what do I do now? It's 15 degrees outside and my house is getting colder by the minute. I have frozen pipes to worry about, not to mention just basic survival." "I'm dispatching an emergency crew right now," Marcus assured me. "They'll be there within 2 hours to restore your service. I'm also flagging this account with a special protection status, which means that no one except our authorized personnel can disconnect your service going forward, and any attempt to do so will result in immediate police involvement. I'm also going to need you to file a formal complaint, and I'm going to escalate this to our legal department. We take this kind of thing very seriously, Mr. Jacobs. The HOA needs to understand that they've crossed a major line." I thanked Marcus and hung up, then immediately went to my car to warm up while I waited for the utility crew. As I sat there with the heater blasting, I pulled up my email on my phone to search for any correspondence from the HOA about violations or fines. There was nothing. Not a single email, letter, or notice of any kind. I checked my spam folder, my trash, everywhere. Nothing. I had received the standard monthly HOA newsletter about upcoming community events and reminders to clear snow from sidewalks, but absolutely nothing about violations. 45 minutes later, a Commonwealth Edison truck pulled up in front of my house, which was faster than the promised 2 hours. 2 technicians got out, both looking annoyed as they approached my meter. The older one, whose name tag reads Sullivan, examined the orange tag with a scowl. "This is the 3rd time this month we've had to deal with this HOA," Sullivan said, shaking his head. "They think they run the whole world. Last week they tried to disconnect power to a house because the owner painted their front door the wrong shade of blue. People don't understand that utility infrastructure isn't something you can just mess with because you're on a power trip." The younger technician, Rodriguez, was already working on unlocking the meter. "This lock isn't even one of ours," he noted. "They put their own lock on here." That's definitely illegal tampering with utility equipment. Within 15 minutes, my power was restored, and I could hear my furnace kick on with a blessed whoosh of warm air. Sullivan handed me several business cards and a printed document. "This is the incident report number, and these cards are for our legal department and our customer advocacy team. You're going to want to pursue this, Mr. Jacobs. What they did isn't just annoying, it's dangerous. If you hadn't caught this tonight, and your pipes had frozen and burst, you'd be looking at thousands of dollars in damage. If you had been elderly or had medical equipment that required power, this could have been life-threatening." After they left, I sat in my warming living room and tried to decide my next move. It was almost 8 in the evening, too late to call the HOA management office, so I decided to draft an email instead. I laid out exactly what had happened, attached photos of the HOA tag on my meter, and demanded an immediate explanation. I kept my tone professional but firm, making it clear that I expected answers and that I had already involved the utility company. The next morning, I woke up to find my inbox flooded with emails. The first was from the HOA president, a woman named Patricia Pemberton, who I had only met once at a community meeting 2 years ago. Her email was short and dismissive, stating that I had received multiple notices about violations including an unauthorized satellite dish and non-approved exterior lighting, and that the power disconnection was a final enforcement action after I had ignored all previous attempts at communication. She ended the email by saying that my power would remain subject to disconnection until I paid a fine of $1,500 and removed the violations within 72 hours. I read the email twice, my anger building with each word. I didn't have a satellite dish. I had never had a satellite dish. My exterior lighting consisted of the 2 standard coach lights flanking my front door that had been installed by the builder and were identical to those on every other house in the neighborhood. This was insane. The second email was from Marcus at Commonwealth Edison, sent at 6 in the morning. He informed me that their legal department had reviewed the incident and would be sending a formal cease and desist letter to the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, demanding that they never again interfere with utility service to any property in the subdivision. He also mentioned that they were considering filing a police report for theft of services and tampering with utility equipment, and asked if I would be willing to cooperate with any investigation. I immediately replied that I would absolutely cooperate, and then I called my employer to let them know I would be working from home for the day. I had too much to deal with to focus on anything else. My next call was to a real estate attorney named Donald Chen, who had helped me with my home purchase 3 years ago. His secretary put me through right away, and I spent 20 minutes explaining the entire situation. Xavier, this is one of the most egregious HOA overreaches I've heard about in years, Donald said, his tone grave. And I've heard some doozies. The fact that they physically disconnected your power without any legal authority is bad enough, but claiming you have violations that don't exist and demanding payment for them is fraud and extortion. We need to document everything. Do you have any of these supposed notices they claim to have sent you? Not a single one, I confirmed. I've searched my email, my physical mail, everything. There's nothing. And the violations they're claiming don't even exist. They say I have a satellite dish, but I don't. I've never had one. They say my exterior lights are non-approved, but they're the exact same lights that came with the house and that every other house has. Donald was quiet for a moment, then said, I want you to take detailed photos of your entire property, focusing especially on the areas where they claim violations exist. Date stamp everything. Then I want you to walk around the neighborhood and photograph other houses with the same features. We're going to build a case that shows not only did they act illegally, but they also targeted you specifically for reasons we'll need to uncover. I'm also going to send a letter to the HOA on your behalf, putting them on notice that any further harassment or illegal actions will result in a lawsuit. I spent the next 2 hours doing exactly as Donald instructed, walking around my frigid neighborhood with my phone camera, documenting everything. My next-door neighbor, an older man named Robert who had lived in Meadowbrook Hills since the subdivision was first built 15 years ago, came out to ask what I was doing. HOA problems, I said simply, and Robert's face darkened. Let me guess, Patricia is at it again, he said, shaking his head. That woman has made it her personal mission to make everyone's life miserable since she became president last year. She tried to find me because my newspaper was sitting on my driveway for more than 4 hours one Sunday. 4 hours. I was at church, for crying out loud. What did she do to you? I explained the power disconnection, and Robert's eyes widened. She had your power shut off. Xavier, that's insane. That's got to be illegal. My son is a lawyer. Let me give him a call and see what he says. I already have an attorney on it, I assured him, but I appreciate it. Did you say she's been president for a year? What happened to the previous board? Robert leaned in conspiratorially. The previous board was pretty reasonable. They focused on actual community maintenance and keeping things running smoothly. But Patricia moved into the neighborhood about 18 months ago, and within 3 months, she had organized a coup. She got a bunch of her friends to show up at the annual meeting. They voted out the entire previous board and installed themselves. Since then, she's been on a rampage. New rules every month, fines for everything, and she's got this crew of busybodies who drive around looking for violations. It's like living in a police state. This was valuable information. I thanked Robert and continued my documentation, making sure to get clear photos showing that my exterior lights were standard throughout the neighborhood, and taking several photos showing that I definitely did not have a satellite dish anywhere on my property. That afternoon, I received a phone call from an unknown number. It was a woman who identified herself as Karen Whitmore, the HOA's enforcement officer. Her voice had that particular quality of someone who derived immense pleasure from wielding petty authority. Mr. Jacobs, this is Karen Whitmore from the Meadowbrook Hills HOA Enforcement Committee. I'm calling to schedule an inspection of your property to verify that you've removed the violations and to collect the outstanding fines before we can authorize the utility company to restore your power. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. Miss Whitmore, My power has already been restored by Commonwealth Edison because what you did was illegal. And I don't have any violations to remove because the violations you're claiming don't exist. I don't have a satellite dish, and my exterior lighting is identical to every other house in this neighborhood. There was a pause, and when Karen spoke again, her tone had turned icy. Mr. Jacobs, I personally documented the violations during my inspection of your property on February 3rd. If you're claiming that I falsified my report, that's a very serious accusation. Today is February 4th, I said, checking my phone calendar. You're saying you inspected my property yesterday. What time? Another pause. I don't have to provide you with that level of detail. The point is that violations were documented, and you need to comply with the enforcement action. Miss Whitmore, I was home all day yesterday. It was my day off, and I was working on some projects inside my house. No one from the HOA came to my property. If you're claiming you conducted an inspection, I'd like to see the photographic evidence that I'm sure you took to document these supposed violations. The silence stretched longer this time. We don't always take photographs. Sometimes visual confirmation is sufficient. That's convenient, I said, not bothering to hide my skepticism. Well, I have taken photographs, dozens of them, showing that I don't have a satellite dish and that my lights are standard. I've also taken photos of other houses in the neighborhood with identical features who apparently aren't being targeted for enforcement actions. My attorney will be very interested in discussing why I'm being singled out. Your attorney? Karen's voice rose slightly. Mr. Jacobs, there's no need to involve lawyers. This is a simple community standards matter. If you would just cooperate and pay the fines, this could all be resolved quickly. What you did was illegal, Miss Whitmore. You or someone acting on behalf of the HOA physically disconnected my power without authorization from the utility company. That's theft of services and tampering with utility equipment. Commonwealth Edison has already flagged my account with special protection status and is considering filing criminal charges. So no, I won't be paying any fines for violations that don't exist, and I won't be cooperating with an organization that commits crimes. I could hear Karen's breathing becoming more rapid. You're making a mistake, Mr. Jacobs. The HOA has broad authority to enforce community standards, and if you fight us on this, we can make your life very difficult. We can place liens on your property. We can fine you daily for non-compliance. We can even force you to sell your home. Are you threatening me? I asked, making sure to note the time and date of this call from my attorney. Because that sounds like harassment and intimidation. I'm going to end this call now, but I want you to know that this entire conversation has been documented. Any further contact from the HOA needs to go through my attorney. His name is Donald Chen, and I'll have his contact information sent to your office by the end of the day. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. This was escalating faster than I had expected, and Karen's threats about liens and forced sales concerned me, even though I suspected they were mostly bluster. I immediately called Donald to update him on the conversation. She threatened you with a lien and forcing you to sell, Donald repeated, his tone sharp. That's actionable. That's harassment and intimidation. Xavier, I think we need to go on the offensive here. I'm going to draft a comprehensive letter to the HOA board, their management company, and their insurance carrier. We're going to lay out exactly what happened, the laws they violated, and the consequences they'll face if they continue this behavior. I'm also going to recommend that you file a police report for the power disconnection. This has gone beyond a civil matter. Taking Donald's advice, I drove to the Naperville Police Department that afternoon and filed a formal complaint. The officer who took my report, a middle-aged woman named Officer Delgado, listened carefully and took extensive notes. "Mr. Jacobs, utility tampering is taken very seriously in Illinois," she explained. "It's not just a civil issue. Under Illinois statute, unauthorized interference with utility service is a misdemeanor, and in cases where it creates a dangerous situation, which extreme cold weather would qualify, it can be elevated to a felony. I'm going to open a case file on this, and will likely need to interview the HOA board members to determine who authorized or performed the disconnection." The utility company said they would cooperate with any investigation, I offered. "They have records of when the disconnection happened, and photos their technicians took of the unauthorized lock that was placed on my meter." Officer Delgado nodded approvingly. "That's excellent. I'll coordinate with ComEd as part of the investigation. In the meantime, if you experience any further harassment from the HOA, or if they attempt to disconnect your utilities again, call 911 immediately. Don't wait. What they did is serious enough that we would respond to it as an emergency." I left the police station feeling more confident that I was taking the right steps, but also increasingly disturbed by how far the HOA had been willing to go. When I got home, I found a certified letter notice in my mailbox. I would have to pick up the actual letter from the post office, but I had a sinking feeling I knew who it was from. The next morning, I went to the post office before work and retrieved the certified letter. As expected, it was from the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, but the contents were even more outrageous than I had anticipated. The letter, signed by Patricia Pemberton, informed me that due to my continued violations and hostile attitude toward community standards enforcement, the HOA board had voted to impose daily fines of $200 until the violations were corrected. Additionally, they were assessing a $1,500 enforcement action fee and a $1,000 utilities restoration processing fee. The total came to $2,500, due immediately, with daily fines accruing until paid. The letter went on to state that failure to pay within 10 days would result in the HOA filing a lien against my property, and that I was hereby banned from all community amenities, including the neighborhood park, swimming pool, and clubhouse, until all fines were paid and violations corrected. I photographed every page of the letter and immediately forwarded them to Donald. His response came within an hour, consisting of just 3 words. "This is gold." He called me shortly after. "Xavier, they've just handed us everything we need for a lawsuit. They're attempting to collect money for violations that don't exist. They're imposing fines that have no basis in reality, and they're doing it after committing a criminal act. I'm drafting a lawsuit for harassment, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of authority. We're also going to seek an injunction preventing them from taking any further action against you, and we're going to ask for attorney's fees and punitive damages." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, the practical concern cutting through my anger. "I'm willing to take this on contingency," Donald said. "This is such a clear-cut case of HOA abuse, and the damages are substantial enough that I'm confident we'll win. Plus, I've been looking for a good test case to establish precedent on HOA overreach in Illinois, and this is perfect. If you're comfortable with that arrangement, we'll move forward with you paying nothing upfront, and my fees come out of the settlement or judgment." I agreed immediately, relieved that I wouldn't have to drain my savings to fight this battle. Donald explained that he would file the lawsuit by the end of the week, and that he would also be sending a cease and desist letter to the HOA. demanding that they rescind all fines and take no further action against me pending the outcome of the litigation. That evening, I decided to attend the HOA's monthly board meeting. As a homeowner in the subdivision, I had the right to attend, and I wanted to see Patricia and Karen in person to put faces to the voices and emails that had been making my life miserable. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a modest building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed a small gym and party room. When I arrived at 7 in the evening, there were already about 20 people seated in folding chairs facing a long table where the board members sat. I recognized Patricia immediately. She was a thin woman in her early 50s with severely pulled back blonde hair and the kind of expression that suggested she had just smelled something unpleasant. Next to her sat Karen, who was younger and rounder, with dark hair cut in an unflattering bob. 3 other board members completed the lineup, all women who looked to be Patricia's contemporaries. I took a seat in the back row, and Patricia's eyes locked onto me immediately. She leaned over and whispered something to Karen, who turned to look at me with undisguised hostility. The meeting began with standard business discussing landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules for the upcoming summer. Then they moved to the enforcement report, and Karen stood up with a clipboard. "This month we issued 47 violation notices," Karen announced proudly, as if this were an achievement to be celebrated. Categories included unauthorized decorations, improper waste bin placement, lawn maintenance deficiencies, and architectural violations. We collected $8,200 in fines, which has been deposited in the HOA reserve fund. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. One man, sitting a few rows ahead of me, raised his hand. I received a violation notice for having my trash cans visible from the street, but it was on trash collection day. The cans were out because the truck was coming. "Is that really a violation?" Patricia leaned forward, her voice cold. "The covenants clearly state that waste receptacles must not be visible from the street except during collection hours. If your bins were out overnight, that's a violation." "But the truck comes at 6 in the morning," the man protested. "Am I supposed to wake up before 6 just to put my cans out at the exact moment the truck arrives?" "That's not our concern," Patricia said dismissively. "The rules exist for a reason. If everyone just did whatever they wanted, this neighborhood would fall into chaos and property values would plummet. The fine stands." I watched this exchange with growing disbelief. The man looked like he wanted to argue further but ultimately slumped back in his chair, defeated. The meeting continued with more reports and discussions, and then Patricia opened the floor for homeowner comments. I stood up, and every head in the room turned toward me. "My name is Xavier Jacobs. I live at 2847 Oakmont Drive. 2 days ago, someone acting on behalf of this HOA illegally disconnected my electrical power in the middle of winter." The room erupted in whispers. Patricia's face flushed red, and she banged her gavel against the table. "Mr. Jacobs, that was an enforcement action taken due to your multiple violations and refusal to comply with community standards." "I don't have any violations," I said, keeping my voice level and clear. "You claim I have a satellite dish. I don't. You claim my exterior lights are non-approved. They're identical to every other house in this neighborhood. I never received any notices about violations before my power was shut off, and what you did was illegal. Commonwealth Edison has confirmed that only licensed utility workers can disconnect service, and only the utility company can authorize such disconnections. The Naperville Police Department has opened a criminal investigation into the matter." The whispers turned into louder conversations. Patricia was banging her gavel repeatedly. "That's enough, Mr. Jacobs. You're out of order. This is not the forum for your personal grievances. Actually, homeowner comment period is exactly the forum for this," I replied. "And everyone in this room deserves to know that the HOA board is committing crimes in the name of enforcement. What happened to me could happen to any of you. They could target you next with fake violations and dangerous illegal actions." Karen jumped to her feet. "The violations are not fake. I documented them myself during a property inspection." "When?" I challenged. "What date and time did you inspect my property?" "Because I have evidence that proves I was home the day you claim to have conducted the inspection, and no one from the HOA came to my door or entered my property." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Patricia stood up, her face now purple with rage. "This meeting is adjourned. Everyone needs to leave now. You can't just adjourn the meeting because you don't like what someone is saying," another homeowner called out. "We have rights." But Patricia and the other board members were already gathering their papers and heading for the back door. The meeting dissolved into chaos as homeowners stood up, arguing amongst themselves and calling out questions that went unanswered. Several people approached me, asking for more details about what had happened. I gave them brief summaries and handed out several of Donald's business cards to those who said they had also been targeted with questionable fines and violations. One woman, who introduced herself as Michelle, told me that the HOA had fined her $800 because her son had left his bicycle on the front lawn overnight. "It was one time," she said, her voice frustrated and tired. "He forgot to put it in the garage before bed." The next morning, there was a violation notice on my door and a fine assessed. $800 for a bicycle being on the lawn for maybe 10 hours. I paid it because I was scared they'd put a lien on my house. A younger couple told me they had received a violation for having a wreath on their door that was too large according to the HOA's new decoration standards. An elderly man said he had been fined because his grass was half an inch longer than the permitted maximum height, even though he had just mowed 3 days earlier. The stories kept coming, and a picture emerged of an HOA board that had become drunk on power, using their authority to extract money from homeowners through an endless barrage of petty violations and excessive fines. I exchanged contact information with several people, suggesting that there might be strength in numbers if others wanted to join in legal action against the board. Over the next few days, things escalated rapidly. Donald filed the lawsuit in DuPage County Circuit Court, and the HOA was served with the complaint along with a motion for a temporary restraining order preventing them from taking any further action against me. Commonwealth Edison sent their formal cease and desist letter, and I received a copy. The language was blunt and threatening, stating that any further interference with utility service would result in immediate criminal prosecution and civil liability for damages. The police investigation moved forward as well. Officer Delgado called to inform me that they had interviewed Patricia and Karen, and both had admitted that Karen had personally disconnected my power by turning off the main breaker at my meter. Karen claimed she had taken an online tutorial on how to do it, and believed she had the authority as the enforcement officer. Patricia insisted that the HOA covenants gave them the right to take all necessary measures to enforce compliance. "They don't seem to understand the seriousness of what they did," Officer Delgado told me. "We've recommended that the state's attorney's office pursue charges." Given that it was premeditated, done in winter conditions that created a dangerous situation, and done with the intent to coerce payment of money, we're recommending Class 4 felony charges for theft and class a misdemeanor for utility interference. This was moving faster than I had anticipated. What had started as an infuriating inconvenience was now becoming a criminal case. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part felt almost uncomfortable with how severe the consequences were becoming. Almost, but not quite. They had shut off my power in February in Illinois. They could have killed someone if they had done this to an elderly person or someone with medical equipment. 2 weeks after I filed the police report, Patricia and Karen were formally charged. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. My phone buzzed constantly with texts and calls from neighbors, some supporting me, others accusing me of overreacting and destroying the HOA over a simple mistake. One particularly nasty voicemail came from a woman who didn't identify herself. "I hope you're proud of yourself, Xavier. Patricia and Karen are good people who volunteer their time to keep this neighborhood nice, and you're ruining their lives over nothing. They made a mistake, but you're taking it way too far. People like you are what's wrong with America, always looking to sue and cause trouble instead of just working things out like adults." I deleted the message without responding, though it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Was I overreacting? But then, I remembered coming home to a dark, freezing house. I remembered the lies about violations that didn't exist. I remembered Karen's threats on the phone about making my life difficult and forcing me to sell my home. No, I wasn't overreacting. They had crossed serious lines, and they needed to be held accountable. The criminal case moved through the system while the civil lawsuit progressed on a parallel track. Donald filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the facts were so clear and undisputed that there was no need for a trial. The HOA's attorney, a harried-looking man named Gerald Morrison, filed a response that attempted to argue that the HOA had a good faith belief in their authority to disconnect utilities, and that the violations, while perhaps not properly documented, were real. In his response to that, Donald shredded every argument. He included affidavits from ComEd confirming the illegality of the disconnection, photos I had taken proving the violations didn't exist, and testimony from multiple neighbors about the HOA's pattern of harassment and excessive enforcement. He also included Karen's threatening phone call, which I had memorialized in a detailed memo immediately after it happened. In April, 3 months after my power had been shut off, both cases came to a head in the same week. The criminal case was first. Patricia and Karen had both been advised by their attorney to accept a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to misdemeanor charges, the felony theft charges would be dropped, and they would receive probation, community service, and fines. They would also be required to resign from the HOA board immediately, and could not serve in any HOA leadership capacity for 5 years. I attended the plea hearing at the DuPage County Courthouse in Wheaton. The courtroom was small and sterile, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Patricia and Karen sat at the defense table with their attorney, both looking diminished and exhausted. Patricia's severe hairstyle had been replaced with a softer look, and she wore a conservative navy suit that seemed designed to make her look as non-threatening as possible. Karen kept her eyes down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Catherine Reynolds, reviewed the plea agreement and then addressed Patricia and Karen directly. "Miss Pemberton, Miss Whitmore, do you understand that by accepting this plea agreement, you are admitting that you committed a crime?" They both nodded, and Patricia said in a small voice, "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you understand that you are resigning from your positions with the Homeowners Association and accepting a ban on serving in HOA leadership for 5 years?" Yes, Your Honor. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. I want to be very clear about something. What you did was not a minor infraction. You deprived a resident of an essential utility during dangerous winter weather. You did this without legal authority and in pursuit of fines for violations that apparently did not exist. You put Mr. Jacobs at risk of serious property damage and potential physical harm. The only reason you're receiving probation instead of jail time is because this is your first offense, and because you've agreed to significant restrictions on your future activities. If I ever see either of you in my courtroom again for any kind of abuse of authority or harassment, I will not be as lenient. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, they both whispered. The judge accepted the plea agreement, sentenced them to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service each, and fines of $5,000 each. She also ordered them to submit their resignations to the HOA board within 24 hours. As we left the courtroom, Patricia caught my eye. For a moment I thought she might say something, perhaps apologize, but instead she just looked away and hurried past me. Karen was crying, her face blotchy and red. I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and sympathy. They had brought this on themselves, but seeing their defeat was less satisfying than I had imagined it would be. The civil case resolved 3 days later. Donald called me with the news. Xavier, they want to settle. The HOA's insurance company has reviewed the case and advised them that they will lose badly if this goes to trial. They're offering $50,000, full reimbursement of all legal fees, a written apology to be sent to every homeowner in the subdivision, and a commitment to revise the HOA's enforcement policies and procedures with oversight from an independent community management consultant. $50,000, I repeated, stunned. That seems like a lot. It's actually modest considering what we could potentially get at trial, Donald explained. We could probably push for twice that, maybe more. But settlement means you get the money now, you get certainty, and you don't have to go through the stress of a trial. It's your decision, but I recommend accepting it. I thought about it for a moment. $50,000 would more than compensate me for the stress and hassle of the past 3 months. The written apology would hopefully prevent future abuses by the HOA, and the policy revisions could help protect other homeowners going forward. I'll accept it, I said. But I want to add one more condition. I want the HOA to refund every fine collected by Patricia's board over the past year. If they were willing to lie about violations against me, they probably lied about violations against others. Everyone who was fined in the past year should get their money back. Donald was quiet for a moment. That's going to be a lot of money, Xavier. They might not agree to it. Then we go to trial, I said firmly. This isn't just about me. This is about an entire neighborhood that was terrorized by people who abused their authority. Everyone deserves restitution. Donald went back to the HOA's attorney with the additional demand. There was pushback at first, but when Donald made it clear that I was willing to walk away from the settlement and proceed to trial, where the HOA's abuses would be laid out in detail in public court records, they capitulated. The final settlement included my $50,000, plus a full refund of all fines collected during Patricia's tenure as board president, which totaled approximately $98,000 across 43 different homeowners. The written apology went out to all residents of Meadowbrook Hills in late April. It was remarkably candid, admitting that certain members of the board exceeded their authority and engaged in improper enforcement actions that caused harm to members of our community. It announced Patricia and Karen's resignations, detailed the new oversight and policy reforms that would be implemented, and included information about how homeowners who had been fined could claim their refunds. My mailbox filled with thank you cards over the following weeks. Neighbors stopped me when I was outside to shake my hand and express gratitude. Michelle, the woman whose son had left his bicycle on the lawn, brought me a homemade apple pie and told me that the $800 refund was going to help her catch up on some bills. The elderly man who had been fined for his grass length told me he had been considering selling his house and moving because he couldn't afford the constant stream of fines on his fixed income. But now he felt he could stay. There were still some holdouts who believed I had overreacted, but they were in the minority and mostly kept their opinions to themselves after the criminal convictions and settlement became public knowledge. A new board was elected at an emergency meeting in May, consisting of residents who had been vocal critics of Patricia's regime. The new president, a retired engineer named Thomas, reached out to me personally to apologize on behalf of the HOA and to assure me that things would be different going forward. "We're implementing a complete overhaul of the enforcement process," Thomas explained when we met for coffee at a local diner. "No more surprise fines, no more undocumented violations. Every violation notice will include photographic evidence, and homeowners will get 30 days to correct issues before any fine is imposed. We're also capping fines at reasonable amounts. No more $800 for a bicycle on a lawn or $200 a day for minor issues. And absolutely no one from the HOA will ever touch utility service again. That's being added to our covenants in writing." I appreciated Thomas's approach and told him so. "I never wanted to be at war with the HOA," I said honestly. "I just wanted to be left alone to live my life." If the board focuses on actual community maintenance and reasonable enforcement of standards that matter for property values and safety, I think most people will be happy. "That's the plan," Thomas assured me. "We're here to maintain common areas, organize community events, and handle legitimate issues. We're not here to be the neighborhood police looking for ways to fine people." Over the summer, life in Meadowbrook Hills gradually returned to normal. The pool opened on schedule, community barbecues were held without incident, and the new board proved to be as reasonable as Thomas had promised. I even volunteered to help with the 4th of July celebration, grilling burgers alongside other neighbors and feeling, for the first time since moving to the subdivision, like I was actually part of a community rather than a target. Commonwealth Edison sent me a letter in June informing me that their investigation had concluded and that they had implemented new security measures on all meters in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision to prevent unauthorized tampering. They also thanked me for my cooperation and included a credit on my account for $100 as a gesture of goodwill. Patricia and Karen seemingly disappeared from the neighborhood. I heard through the grapevine that Patricia's marriage had fallen apart in the aftermath of the criminal case, and that she had moved to somewhere in Indiana to live with her sister. Karen apparently still lived in the subdivision, but kept an extremely low profile, never attending community events and rarely being seen outside her house. The $50,000 settlement changed my financial situation significantly. I used part of it to pay off my car loan and put a substantial amount into savings. I also donated $5,000 to a legal aid charity that Donald recommended, which helped low-income homeowners fight HOA abuses. It felt right to pay forward some of the good fortune I had experienced in finding a lawyer willing to take on my case. In August, almost 6 months after that terrible February night when I came home to find my power disconnected, I hosted a small barbecue at my house for some of the neighbors who had supported me through the ordeal. Robert from next door came with his wife, along with Michelle and her son, the young couple who had been fined for their wreath, and several others who had shared their stories with me at that chaotic board meeting. As we sat in my backyard, enjoying the warm summer evening and watching the sun set, Robert raised his beer in a toast to Xavier for having the courage to stand up to bullies and make this neighborhood a better place for all of us. Everyone cheered and clinked their bottles and glasses together. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer temperature. This was what community was supposed to feel like. Not fear of violation notices and arbitrary fines, but genuine connection and mutual support. "I'm just glad it's over," I said honestly. "And I'm glad the system worked. It wasn't easy and it took time, but justice was served in the end." "Do you think Patricia and Karen learned anything from it?" Michelle asked. "Or do you think they still believe they were in the right?" I considered the question. I don't know. I'd like to think they understand now that they crossed serious lines, but some people never accept responsibility for their actions. They always find a way to blame others or justify what they did. All I know is that they can't hurt anyone in this neighborhood anymore, and that's what matters. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and we spent the rest of the evening laughing and sharing stories that had nothing to do with HOAs or property violations. It felt good to be able to move forward, to not have this incident define my entire existence in the neighborhood. As autumn approached and the leaves began to change color, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. If someone had told me a year earlier that I would end up involved in criminal prosecutions and a lawsuit against my HOA, I would have thought they were crazy. I had always been someone who avoided conflict, who tried to stay under the radar and not make waves. But sometimes circumstances force you to stand up for yourself, and I was proud that I had done so. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about documentation, about knowing your rights, and about the importance of not backing down when you know you're in the right. It had also taught me about the dangers of unchecked authority and how quickly reasonable rules can become tools of oppression when put in the wrong hands. In October, I received a letter from the Illinois State Legislature. A representative named Jennifer Walsh had read about my case in a Chicago Tribune article covering HOA abuses in Illinois suburbs. She was sponsoring a bill that would impose stricter regulations on HOA enforcement actions, require mandatory documentation of all violations, limit the amount of fines that could be imposed, and create clearer pathways for homeowners to challenge unfair actions. She asked if I would be willing to testify before a committee considering the bill. I agreed without hesitation. In November, I drove to Springfield and spent a day at the state capitol, sharing my story with legislators and answering their questions. Several other homeowners from various Illinois communities testified as well, describing their own experiences with HOA overreach. The committee members seemed genuinely shocked by some of the stories, and I left feeling cautiously optimistic that real change might result from the ordeal I had endured. The bill eventually passed both chambers of the legislature and was signed into law by the governor the following March. The new law, informally dubbed the Homeowners Bill of Rights, included many of the protections that Representative Walsh had outlined. It wasn't perfect, but it was a significant step forward in reining in the most egregious HOA abuses. When I received a copy of the signed bill in the mail, along with a thank you note from Representative Walsh crediting my testimony as instrumental in building support for the legislation, I felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond my personal victory. Something good had come from a terrible situation. Other homeowners across Illinois would now have protections that hadn't existed before. As I approached the one-year anniversary of the power disconnection, I found myself in a much different place than I could have imagined during those dark February days. My relationship with the HOA was cordial and professional. The neighborhood had become a genuinely pleasant place to live. I had made real friends among my neighbors, bonded by our shared experience of surviving Patricia's reign and working together to build something better. On the actual anniversary date, February 3rd of the following year, I came home from work to find my house warm and brightly lit, exactly as it should be. I stood in my driveway for a moment, looking at my home and feeling grateful for electricity, for heat, for the simple ability to flip a switch and have lights come on. It was something most people took for granted, but I never would again. Inside, I poured myself a drink and sat down in my living room, thinking about the journey of the past year. I had learned that standing up for yourself isn't always easy, but it's necessary. I had learned that systems of accountability do work, even if they sometimes move slowly. I had learned that communities can heal and improve when people are willing to speak up and demand better. Most importantly, I had learned that you don't have to accept abuse from anyone, even if they claim to have authority over you. Patricia and Karen had believed that their positions on the HOA board gave them unlimited power to harass and intimidate homeowners. They had been wrong, and they had paid a significant price for their misconduct. I never saw Patricia again after that day in court. Karen I glimpsed occasionally from a distance, usually getting into her car early in the morning or retrieving mail quickly before retreating back inside. I felt no particular animosity toward either of them anymore. The anger had faded, replaced by a kind of weary understanding that people sometimes make terrible choices and have to live with the consequences. The neighborhood thrived under the new board leadership. Property values actually increased, not because of aggressive enforcement of petty rules, but because people felt good about living there and took pride in their homes. Community events were well attended and genuinely enjoyable. The pool was always busy during the summer, the park was filled with playing children, and the clubhouse hosted regular activities that brought neighbors together. I stayed in touch with Donald Chen, my attorney, who occasionally called to update me on other HOA cases he was handling. The precedent set by my case had proven useful in several other situations, helping other homeowners fight back against abusive boards. Donald joked that I had inadvertently become the patron saint of oppressed homeowners in Illinois, a title I accepted with humor if not complete seriousness. Robert next door became a good friend, and we developed a routine of having coffee together most Saturday mornings, sitting on one of our porches and discussing everything from politics to sports to neighborhood gossip. He often reminded me of that dark period and how much things had changed. "You know," he said one morning as we watched neighbors walking their dogs past my house, "this whole experience could have gone very differently. If you hadn't documented everything, if you hadn't found a good lawyer, if the utility company hadn't backed you up, Patricia and Karen might have gotten away with it. You might have ended up being the one who was forced out." "I know," I agreed. "I got lucky in a lot of ways. But I also refused to just accept what they were doing. I think that made the difference. They were used to people either not knowing their rights or being too intimidated to fight back." "True," Robert nodded. "And look at what your refusal to back down accomplished. Not just for you, but for everyone. The neighborhood is better, state law is better, and two people who abused their authority faced consequences. That matters." It did matter, and as I settled into my second full year living in Meadowbrook Hills, I felt a contentment that had been absent before. My home was truly mine, protected by both law and a community that had learned hard lessons about the dangers of unchecked authority. The story of what happened that February spread beyond our neighborhood and even beyond Illinois. National news outlets picked up the story, and I did several interviews for articles about HOA abuses. I appeared on a consumer advocacy podcast, sharing my experience and offering advice to other homeowners facing similar situations. The consistent message I tried to convey was simple. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to seek help from authorities when lines are crossed. Some people reached out to me directly through social media and email, sharing their own HOA horror stories and asking for advice. I tried to respond to as many as I could, directing them to resources and encouraging them to fight back when they were being treated unjustly. It was impossible to help everyone, but I felt an obligation to try, knowing how isolated and powerless I had felt during those first days after my power was shut off. Life moved forward, as it always does. I got a promotion at work, started dating someone I met at a community barbecue, and continued to make my house feel more like a home with various improvements and updates. Each time I flipped a light switch or adjusted the thermostat, I experienced a brief moment of gratitude that these basic utilities worked as they should, without interference from anyone with delusions of authority. The final chapter of the story came almost 18 months after the initial incident. I received a notice that the HOA's insurance company was closing out the claim related to my settlement. Included with the notice was a brief letter from the insurance company's legal department, explaining that they had conducted a comprehensive review of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA's operations and had required significant changes to their policies and board training as a condition of continuing coverage. The letter noted that my case had been an important catalyst for changes not just in our subdivision, but across the insurance company's entire portfolio of HOA clients. They had implemented new requirements for documentation, new caps on fines, new procedures for notices and appeals, and mandatory training for all board members on legal limits of their authority. My willingness to pursue the matter to its conclusion had rippled out in ways I hadn't anticipated, protecting potentially thousands of homeowners from similar abuses. I kept that letter in a folder with all the other documents from the case, a paper trail that told the story of how an ordinary person had stood up to institutional bullying and won. It wasn't a story I thought about every day anymore, but it remained an important part of my personal narrative, a reminder of my own capacity to fight for what was right even when it was difficult and uncertain. On a warm spring evening nearly 2 years after that terrible February night, I sat on my front porch with a beer, watching the sun set and feeling genuinely at peace. The neighborhood was quiet, with just the sounds of distant lawnmowers and children playing. My house was comfortable and mine. My neighbors were friends rather than adversaries, and the HOA was functioning as it should have all along, providing services rather than harassment. Patricia and Karen were gone from my daily life, though they would always be characters in this story. I hoped they had learned from their mistakes and found some measure of peace in whatever lives they were living now. The anger I had felt toward them had long since transformed into something more like pity mixed with a firm conviction that consequences for bad actions are both necessary and just. As darkness fell and I prepared to go inside to my warm, well-lit house, I thought about how this experience had changed me. I was more aware of my rights now, more willing to question authority, more conscious of the importance of documentation and evidence. I was also more connected to my community, having been through a shared struggle that brought people together. The lights came on automatically as I entered my house, a simple convenience that I would never again take for granted. I was home, truly home, in a place where I belonged and where I was protected by both law and community. It had been a long, difficult journey to get here, but standing in my brightly lit living room on that spring evening, I knew every minute of the struggle had been worth it.